My name is Matt Lindstrom. I'm Associate Professor of Political Science and Director of the Eugene J. McCarthy Center for Public Policy and Civic Engagement. We just have a couple quick remarks. I first want to warmly thank Senator McCarthy's son, Michael, who is here tonight, his daughter Ellen, and her husband Charlie Howell. Gene's sister-in-law Muriel McCarthy is here, as well as Senator McCarthy's niece, Mary Beth Yarrow, and other members of the family and friends for their enthusiasm for this lectureship at St. John's, and for all of you who have helped to underwrite it. So thank you very much. If you would, family members, if you just want to raise your hand just to be acknowledged, thank you for coming. Appreciate that. I also want to thank Dan and Catherine Whalen for their generous contribution establishing the Eugene J. McCarthy Center for Public Policy and Civic Engagement, which hosts this particular lecture. And in case you don't know, Dan Whalen has also graciously accepted the presidency of St. John's University, and we appreciate that as well. Abbot John, we also appreciate your presence very much. And we also have three special guests with us this evening. Mary Ann Benninger, President of the College of St. Benedict, if you could stand. Where are you? There you go. Our beloved brother Dietrich Reinhardt, President Emeritus of St. John's University. And Jim Fry, Chair of our Board of Regents here at St. John's University. Thanks, Jim. So what we're going to do here in the next couple minutes is show a few pictures, talk a little bit about the life of Senator McCarthy. For some of you may not know too much about him, so we'll just say a few words about Eugene J. McCarthy, and then we'll move on with the program. If you're coming in, feel free to grab seats. I think there's a few up front. So, see about this. On behalf of St. John's University, welcome to the Eugene J. McCarthy Lecture. The McCarthy Lectureship was established in 2006 to honor and memorialize Senator Gene McCarthy, a remarkable and courageous individual, a man whose legacy reverberates far beyond St. John's and the state of Minnesota. Gene McCarthy died in December 2005, came to St. John's at the age of 15 to complete prep school and graduate from St. John's University in 1935 at the age of 19 years old. It's pretty young for some of you current students, so take note of that. The next 14 years were filled with teaching, graduate study. He was a novice in the St. John's Abbey. He served in World War II in military intelligence. He was married, started a family, and even had a stint at farming. In 1948, Gene entered the U.S. House of Representatives, where he served for 10 years as a congressman representing St. Paul, Minnesota. In 1958, Gene was elected U.S. Senator from Minnesota, a position he held for 2 terms. Senator McCarthy is widely credited with changing the face of American politics by following his conscience. Convinced that the Vietnam War had to be reversed, stopped, he risked his political future in what appeared to be a quixotic challenge to the sitting president of his own party in the 1968 primaries. I believe we'll hear a little bit more about that in a few minutes. He did not win the nomination, but his courage gave voice to countless supporters, especially young people, and he brought a new generation into the political process. After retiring from the Senate in 1971, Gene was a presidential candidate in 5 campaigns and remained active as an accomplished speaker, writer, and poet. Gene always had a great hope for the young and a deep optimism about the capacity of education to establish a life trajectory of purpose and significance. Gene wanted students now and in the future to resonate deeply with the same intellectual movements that had expanded his horizons and set his course as a student here. This annual lecture seeks to honor Gene McCarthy's distinguished contributions to the political, intellectual, and spiritual life of America by exploring the same terrain of ideas that shaped him. In this way, we seek to rise up in this and in future generations the same tenacious love for the common good that animated Gene McCarthy's life. The theme of the McCarthy Lecture series is conscious and courage in public life, because this is what Gene McCarthy embodied. This series carries on the Senator's deep commitment to the ideals and principles of democratic self-government, seeking to impress a new generation of young people, and indeed all of us, to pursue fresh ideas and challenge the status quo to effect positive change in our communities, and like Senator McCarthy, to lead our lives with honesty, integrity, and courage. This annual lecture series will feature speakers who address topics cherished by the Senator: politics, poetry, social and economic justice, constitutional reform, campaign finance. Maybe we'll throw in some sports. As you know, he was quite an athlete, as well as other public policy issues. So, with this, I want to introduce Joe Desjardins, who's a professor of philosophy, associate, not a political scientist. He hasn't moved up that far yet, but sorry, Joe. I should never ad-lib. But he is a fantastic professor of philosophy. He is also associate professor and academic dean at the College of St. Benedict and St. John's University. He will introduce Professor Julian Bond. Thank you, Joe.
We'll see what happens to the political science budget tomorrow. Tonight's McCarthy lecturer, Julian Bond, chairman of the board of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, is well known to all of us. In fact, this is his second visit to St. John's. In 1978, in fact 30 years ago next week, Professor Bond spoke on the topic of the apotheosis of the new politics. For students who are here, I will invoke my deanly authority to give you extra credit on your exams if you can define apotheosis. From reports in the student newspaper, his lecture was penetrating and clear and received a standing ovation. From his student days to his current chairmanship of the NAACP, Professor Bond has been an active participant in the movements for civil rights and economic justice. As an activist who has faced jail for his convictions, as a veteran of more than 20 years of service in the Georgia General Assembly, as a university professor, and as a writer, he has been on the cutting edge of social change since the 1960s. As a student at Morehouse College in Atlanta, Professor Bond helped found the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. From 1965 to 1975, he served as a Democratic member of the Georgia House for 4 terms. Like Senator McCarthy, he was a strong opponent of the Vietnam War. He went on to serve 6 terms in the Georgia State Senate. He was the first president of the Southern Poverty Law Center, and since 1998, he has served as chairman of the board of the NAACP, the oldest and largest civil rights organization in the United States. In 2002, he received the prestigious National Freedom Award. Professor Bond is currently Distinguished Professor at American University in Washington, D.C., and serves as a Professor of History at the University of Virginia. A little remembered fact, perhaps, is that Professor Bond seconded the nomination of Senator McCarthy at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago in 1968. He was also, I believe, the first African American nominated for the vice presidency at that convention. He was, unfortunately, perhaps, much too young to serve as vice president, so he declined standing for the nomination. A few weeks ago, I had the opportunity to read a report written by former dean, one of my predecessors here, Bob Spaeth, By the way, there's a great picture of Bob Spaeth and Gene McCarthy up in the philosophy department as young men sitting together. It's just a really, really fantastic shot. And Bob wrote at the start of a report a line that has stayed with me and that really made me think of tonight. He said, "Looking back to find the way forward, history for the sake of the future has been the special genius of the Benedictine tradition." And I think of that line as I thought about the McCarthy Lecture and as I thought about Professor Bond's talk tonight. We honor Gene McCarthy and we listen to Julian Bond not to play some baby boomer nostalgia game, remembering what it was like in the 60s. We all got clean for Gene and got our haircuts and tried to change the world. But we do it to try to help us form a vision of the future. We really do it for our students. The lecture tonight in the McCarthy Lecture series is really for the future. Try to learn from the past, but learn to try to make the world maybe just a little more just and civil place. Professor Bond will speak to us tonight on the 1960s civil rights and anti-war movements, memories of Senator McCarthy, and the 1968 Democratic Convention in Chicago, where the intersection of race and politics played, perhaps other than this year, one of the most monumental roles in American history. At a time when we are a week away from really the most historic presidential election, I think, where we will either have the first woman vice president or the first African-American president. Just a perfect time to invite our guest tonight. So with that, please join me in welcoming Julian Bond to the podium for the second Eugene J. McCarthy Lecture.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you a great deal. Thank you a great deal for that kind introduction. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your warm, warm welcome. I'd also like to introduce someone else here, and that is the president of the St. Cloud NAACP, Mr. John Lewis. Stand up, Mr. Lewis. I want the audience to see President Lewis, because I don't doubt that there are people here whose NAACP membership has lapsed. And without letting another day go forward, if after the program you'll see President Lewis, he can sign you up right away. Now remember, in the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, we believe colored people come in all colors. Anybody who shares our values is more than welcome, and we would love to have all of you join if you want to. I don't know if he's got 600 membership applications in his pocket, but I'm sure he can get them kind of quickly. So thank you for coming, President Lewis. Now, I'm happy to be here for many, many reasons. First, I'm an honorary Minnesotan by marriage. Indeed, my wife and I met at Macalester College, her alma mater, at a nationwide anti-war rally held on Moratorium Day to End the War in Vietnam on October 15th, 1969. I was the principal speaker, and when my plane was late, Minnesota's Attorney General warmed up the audience. His name was Walter Mondale. Now, I caught my wife here in Minnesota, but I'm sorry to tell you, I also caught a cold, and I hope you'll bear with me as the evening progresses. But in addition to that association, as you've heard, I seconded the nomination of Senator McCarthy at the '68 convention, and I welcome a chance to reminisce about that convention and other events of the 1960s. And what better time than on the eve of this momentous presidential election to honor and remember Eugene McCarthy's belief in the possibility of democracy. He himself said about his campaign for the presidency, "We have proved we are not afraid to test American democracy." That sounds like something this year's Democratic nominee might say. And there are many, many other parallels. Both men courageously on the front line against an unpopular war of choice, both bringing a new generation into politics, and both believers in power from the bottom up. Senator McCarthy was a maverick before Maverick got a bad name. In In 1956, he organized a group of fellow liberals against the Southern Manifesto, a declaration denouncing the Supreme Court's school desegregation ruling signed by 101 members of Congress from the South. The anti-manifesto legislators, known as McCarthy's Mavericks, more formally became the Democratic Study Group, which promoted a progressive legislative agenda. Well, those were the days when women and men from both parties and of all backgrounds worked together in the cause of civil rights. Those were the days when good music was popular and when popular music was good. Those were the days when the president picked the Supreme Court and not the other way around. Those were the days when we had a war on poverty and not a war on the poor. Those were the days when patriotism was a reason for open-eyed disobedience, not an excuse for blind allegiance. Those were the days when the news media really was fair and balanced, and not just stenographers for the powerful. But those were not the good old days. In those days, the law, the courts, the schools, every institution favored whites. This was white supremacy. Dr. King described this world in 1962. He said then, "When you've seen vicious mobs lynch your mothers and fathers at will and drown your sisters and brothers at whim, when you've seen hate-filled policemen curse, kick, and even kill your black brothers and sisters, when you see the vast majority of your 20 million Negro brothers smothering in an airtight cage of poverty in the midst of an affluent society, when you suddenly find your tongue twisted and your speech stammering, as you seek to explain to your 6-year-old daughter why she can't go to the public amusement park that's just been advertised on television, when you see tears welling up in her eyes when she's told Funtown is closed to colored children, and see ominous clouds of inferiority beginning to form in her little mental sky, and see her beginning to distort her personality by developing an unconscious bitterness toward white people, when you have to concoct an answer for a 5-year-old son who's asking, "Daddy, why do white people treat colored people so mean?" When you're harried by day and haunted by night by the fact that you are a Negro, when you're living constantly on tiptoe stance, never quite knowing what to expect next, when you're plagued with inner fears and outer resentments, when you are forever fighting a degenerating sense of nobodiness, then, King said, then you would understand. And you would understand that most Southern blacks then could not vote. They attended inadequate segregated schools, if they went at all, and many attended only for a few months each year. Most could not hope to gain an education beyond high school. Most worked as farmers or semi-skilled laborers. Few of them owned the land they farmed or even the homes in which they lived. This was a massive system of racial preferences, enforced by law and terror. It had one name and one aim: to crush the human development of a whole population. It began with slave catching in Africa, and it continues on to the present day. But in addition to the war in Vietnam, presidential candidate McCarthy regarded the issue of civil rights and the need of the people who live in poverty and suppression in our great cities as the other most pressing problem facing our country. He spoke of sitting on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in 1963, when the Great March on Washington occurred. I was there too, but we did not meet. As a representative of the youngest organization sponsoring the march, my task that day was handing out soft drinks to the celebrities. My most vivid memory of the March on Washington was giving Sammy Davis Jr. a Coke and having him say, "Thanks, kid." So I only knew Senator McCarthy in passing, but it was in passing through a memorable year for both of us and for our country, 1968. At that time, I was a Georgia state legislator. During the midterm elections of 1966, the peace movement, one observer has written, was still very much outside the mainstream of American politics. That was certainly my own experience. I ran for election to the Georgia House in 1965. A federal lawsuit had reapportioned the Georgia General Assembly, reconstituting a legislature where horses and cows had been better represented than human beings. Having created new equal districts in urban Fulton County, the courts had ordered elections for a one-year term. As a successful candidate for one of those new seats, I was to take the oath of office on January 10, 1966. A week earlier, Samuel Young, Jr., a Tuskegee Institute student, a colleague of mine in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, was shot and killed while trying to use the segregated bathroom at a Tuskegee service station. He needed to use the bathroom more than most people because during his Navy service, including the Cuban blockade, he had lost a kidney. And the irony of losing his life because of an illness suffered in service to his country prompted the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee to issue an anti-war statement. We became the first organization to link the prosecution of the Vietnam War with the persecution of blacks at home. We issued a statement which accused the United States of deception in its claims of concern for the freedom of colored peoples in such countries as the Dominican Republic, the Congo, South Africa, Rhodesia, and the United States itself. The United States is no respecter of persons or laws, we said, when such persons or laws run counter to its needs and desires. The statement created a sensation. I was the communication director of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and when I appeared to take the oath of office on January 10, 1966, hostility from white legislators was nearly absolute. They prevented me from taking my oath, they declared my seat vacant, and they ordered another election to fill the vacancy. I won that election and was expelled again. By the time I approached a third election, this time for a regular two-year term, I filed suit in federal court. Judge Griffin Bell, later to become Attorney General in the Carter administration, wrote the majority decision for the three-judge court, which refused to overturn the legislature's decision to deny me the seat to which I had been twice elected. That view was unanimously rejected by the United States Supreme Court, and a year after my first attempt, I became a member of the Georgia House of Representatives. I met your local representative here tonight and told him that when I moved from the House to the Senate, I was told that the IQ went up in both places. But again, in November 1967, Eugene McCarthy announced his candidacy for the Democratic presidential nomination, saying the issue of Vietnam and other related issues should be raised in primaries, of which there were only 15. Given our current nominating process, the one in place in 1968 seems archaic, and it was. Indeed, Hubert Humphrey, McCarthy's fellow Minnesotan, eventually would be nominated without having entered or won a single primary. But McCarthy understood then, as we do now, that the issue of war could not be separated from other areas of United States responsibility. In his announcement speech, he cited the failure to appropriate adequate funds for the poverty program, for housing, for education, and other national needs. Dr. King had made the same point, speaking of the inescapable contradiction between war and social progress at home, and noting that military adventures must stultify domestic progress to ensure the certainty of military success. Today, one day of the Iraqi war cost $720 million, while 37 million Americans and climbing still live in poverty. This represents about 13% of the population, the highest percentage in the developed world. The next man to enter the 1968 presidential race was George Wallace, the segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever governor of Alabama, who was running as an independent. Ironically, Wallace announced on the same day, February 8th, that 3 black students were killed and 27 wounded at South Carolina State when state troopers fired on fleeing anti-segregation demonstrators. This event would become known as the Orangeburg Massacre. In March, Senator McCarthy lost the New Hampshire primary to President Lyndon Johnson, but only by a narrow margin. 4 days after that, Senator Robert Kennedy reversed himself and decided he too would seek the Democratic nomination. He would be a candidate for only 82 days. About 2 weeks later, President Johnson stunned the nation by announcing he would not run for re-election. And just 4 days after that, Martin Luther King Jr. would be dead, gunned down in Memphis, where he'd gone to lead a garbage men strike. King has now been dead 1 year longer than he lived. His death prompted riots in more than 100 cities, including Chicago, the then future site of the Democratic Convention, where 9 blacks were killed and 20 blocks burned. The tumult that marked 1968 continued when on April 23rd, a Columbia University rally against defense contractors on campus and to plan to build a gymnasium in a Harlem park escalated. Students took 3 school officials hostage and occupied several campus buildings for days. This would be but one of countless student-led protests throughout the United States and across the world. That year, as campuses and city streets worldwide became battlegrounds for social change. All of the movements of the decade, anti-war, civil rights, women's rights, environmental, would lead to a questioning of authority and a repudiation of the status quo that I believe is the era's greatest legacy. Through the spring of 1968, I did not have a favorite presidential candidate. On June 5th, my close friend John Lewis, the other John Lewis, called me from Robert Kennedy's suite at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles minutes after Kennedy had won the California primary. John had been urging me to join the Kennedy campaign. After I agreed, John said, "Turn on your TV. Bobby's going downstairs to make his victory announcement." I turned on the TV in time to hear Kennedy say, "It's on to Chicago, let's win there." But he wouldn't make it to Chicago. Moments after his victory speech, he too became victim of an assassin's bullet. His assassination probably changed history. Coming in the wake of President Kennedy's assassination in 1963, on the heels of Martin Luther King's murder, it undeniably cast a permanent pall over the 60s decade. But the election and the campaign had to go on. A group of McCarthy supporters formed a commission, of which I was a member, to reform the nominating process. Named after its chairman, Iowa Governor Harold Hughes, the Hughes Commission's fight at the 1968 convention later provided inspiration and momentum for what was then called the McGovern-Fraser Commission, named after its co-chairs, South Dakota Senator and 1972 Democratic presidential nominee George McGovern, and Minnesotan Don Fraser, former mayor of Minneapolis and a member of Congress. The history of these reform efforts is complex, meriting a speech of its own. Suffice it to say, for our purposes here tonight, that it opened up the political process and helped create the modern presidential primary system. Because the Republicans felt compelled to emulate the Democrats' new rules, it can be said with honesty that both Barack Obama and John McCain owe a great debt to Eugene McCarthy. My home state of Georgia is a perfect illustration of the way boss politics used to operate. In 1968, Georgia's Democratic Convention delegates were handpicked by the party chairman, James Gray, who in turn was handpicked by the governor, Lester Maddox. Maddox was a virulent racist, famous or infamous for giving away axe handles at his segregated restaurant called the Pick Rick. He called these axe handles Pick Rick toothpicks and clearly intended them to be used by his all-white customers to keep black customers away, and Jews they were. Party Chairman Gray picked a 64-person delegation with only 3 black members in a state with nearly 25% black population. He also named delegates pledged to vote for third-party candidate George Wallace rather than anyone running for president as a Democrat. This didn't seem to bother Chairman Gray, whose devotion to the Democratic Party was suspect. He had voted for Republican Barry Goldwater in 1964. But there was support in Georgia for a progressive alternate Democratic delegation. Humphrey's supporters coalesced under the umbrella of an existing group called the Georgia Democratic Forum. When they convened in Macon on August 10th, they were overwhelmed by the McCarthy forces. 70% of the interracial challenge delegation elected in Macon was pledged to Eugene McCarthy, and I was elected co-chair. Now, we didn't expect to be seated at the convention. A small group of us, including Taylor Branch, who had become the Pulitzer Prize-winning biographer of Martin Luther King, went to Chicago to appear before the Credentials Committee. We were stunned when the committee voted to split Georgia's votes, giving half to our delegation and half to the Georgia regulars. The bad news was, with the convention days away, we had no hotel rooms, no money, and no way to bring our own 64-member delegation to Chicago. And then we met Walter Turner, a man Taylor described as straight out of The Godfather. We had told him our sad story. "Why don't you ask my boss?" he said. "Who's your boss?" I asked. "Elijah Muhammad," he answered. Elijah Muhammad was the head of the Nation of Islam, commonly known as black Muslims. He forbade his followers to vote and called all white people blue-eyed devils. We could not imagine that he would help an integrated group come to a convention where voting was the main idea. But Walter arranged for me to have dinner with Mr. Muhammad at his mansion in Hyde Park, where his successor, Louis Farrakhan, lives today, and 4 blocks from where Barack Obama now lives. I left my blue-eyed devil friends behind. In this patriarchic religion, men and women sat at separate tables. After telling them who I was and why I had come, Mr. Muhammad asked them whether or not they should help me. "No," said the women. "We don't know this young man. He may give our money to the devils." My heart sank. Then he turned to the men. Some said yes, some said no. And then Mr. Muhammad turned to me and he said, "Mr. Bond, in the nation of Islam, we listen to the women, but we do what the men say do." And he gave me $3,000 in $100 bills. I never saw Elijah Muhammad again. But I did see Walter Turner again. He took us to the Del Prado Hotel, where we'd already been told there were no winds. Walter went off with the manager, came back in a half hour, and said he had 30 rooms. Mayor Daley opened the Democratic Committee on Monday, August 26. The night before, in the first police riot of a week's violence, police beat and clubbed protesters in Grant Park, across the street from the McCarthy headquarters in the Hilton Hotel. 6,000 Illinois National Guardsmen had been mobilized and were practicing anti-riot drills. Chicago police did the same. On the convention's opening night, 100 people violated an 11 p.m. curfew in Lincoln Park, building a barricade to keep the police out. Police moved in with tear gas. Area residents were pulled from their porches and clubbed. More reporters were attacked that night than any other night of the week. On Tuesday, August 27, tear gas and club-swinging police cleared a 2,000-person crowd in Lincoln Park. At Grant Park that afternoon, I joined Students for a Democratic Society leaders Rennie Davis and Tom Hayden and Peter, Paul, and Mary before a Grant Park crowd of 4,000. On Wednesday, August 28th, I was nominated for Vice President of the United States. I didn't win. That night, the convention also voted down a peace plank proposed for the party's platform. Hearing the news by radio in Grant Park, a protester tried to lower the American flag. Police charged the crowd and beat Rennie Davis into unconsciousness. As the rally ended, peace activist Dave Dillinger unsuccessfully tried to lead the crowd to the amphitheater, but police stopped it. National Guardsmen with .30 caliber machine guns and grenade launchers blocked cross streets. Demonstrators and bystanders were clubbed, beaten, maced, and arrested. It lasted 17 minutes. I seconded Senator McCarthy's nomination for the presidency, following the economist John Kenneth Galbraith, who made the nominating speech. My speech was written for me by Jeremy Larner. Revealing how long ago this was, not only was there no internet, there was not even a fax machine. Larner teletyped the speech to me backstage at the convention. Jeremy Larner was a novelist and screenwriter who won an Oscar in 1973 for The Candidate, starring Robert Redford, a movie about a Senate candidate who sells out his ideals to win a political race. It was one of Dan Quayle's favorite movies. Senator McCarthy did not win the nomination, but as one author has written, his greatest triumph, perhaps, was that he seemed to embody all those old-fashioned virtues, like courage, independence, self-reliance, and generosity of spirit, that the country gave lip service to, but which nobody really thought were much help as guides through the labyrinth of modern life. On March 20th, 1969, the next year, Abby Hoffman, Jerry Rubin, Dave Dillinger, Tom Hayden, Rennie Davis, John Froines, Lee Weiner, Bobby Seale were all indicted for conspiracy, inciting to riot, and other charges related to the convention protest. When Black Panther Bobby Seale refused to be silenced, the judge ordered Seale bound and gagged in the courtroom and then removed from the trial, and the Chicago 8 became the Chicago 7. On February 18, 1970, all 7 defendants were found not guilty of conspiracy, 2 acquitted completely, the remaining 5 convicted of crossing state lines with the intent to incite a riot. All the convictions were reversed in November 1972. Meanwhile, the Walker Commission, appointed to analyze the violence during the convention, concluded it was caused by a police riot. Now, 40 years have passed since 1968, either a short time or a long time, depending on your point of view and your age. A short time in the context of the freedom struggle, whose history is a never-ending struggle between right and wrong. American slavery was a human horror of staggering dimensions, a true crime against humanity. The profits it produced endowed great fortunes and enriched generations, and its dreadful legacy embraces us all today. As historian John Hope Franklin writes, all whites benefited from American slavery. All blacks had no rights they could claim as their own. All whites, including the great majority who owned no slaves, were not only encouraged but authorized to exercise dominion over all slaves, thereby adding to the system of control. Even poor whites benefited from the legal advantage they enjoyed over all blacks, as well as from the psychological advantage of having a group beneath them. Most living Americans, Dr. Franklin says, do have a connection with slavery. They have inherited the preferential advantage if they are white, or the loathsome disadvantage if they are black, and these positions are virtually as alive today as they were in the 19th century. 246 years of slavery were followed by 100 years of state-sanctioned discrimination, reinforced by public and private terror, ending only after a protracted struggle in 1965. Thus, it has only been a short 40 years or so that all black Americans have exercised the full rights of citizens. Only 40 years since legal segregation was ended nationwide. Only 40 years since the right to register and vote was universally guaranteed. Only 40 years since the protections of the law and Constitution were officially extended to all. The country seems proud, and rightly so, that a candidate campaigning in cities where he could not have stayed in a hotel 40 years ago has won his party's nomination for the nation's highest office. But on the heels of Barack Obama's nomination came the crude dissing of Michelle Obama as his baby mama, and the suggestion from a Georgia congressman that the Obamas are uppity, and the continuing portrayal of Obama as a Muslim, as an Arab, or as other. Such is the complex rhythm of our nation's racial dance. We know that Obama's electoral success, even if he should win the ultimate prize, will not signal an end to racial discrimination. But it does mark the high point of an interracial movement that dates back to the Underground Railroad. It was 60 years ago that another Minnesotan, Hubert Humphrey, delivered his famous speech at the 1948 Democratic Convention. That year, the convention platform committee had approved a weak civil rights plank. Humphrey, risking his political career, decided to go against his party and take the fight for a stronger plank to the convention floor. He told the delegates, "Those who say we are rushing on this issue of civil rights, I say we are 172 years too late. To those who say this program is an infringement on states' rights, I say this: the time has arrived for America to get out of the shadow of states' rights and to walk forthrightly in the bright sunshine of human rights." Bill Moyers explained what happened next. When he finished, a mighty roar went up from the crowd. Delegates stood and whooped and shouted and whistled. A 40-piece band played in the aisles. The platform committee was then overruled, and Humphrey's plank voted in by a wide margin. One can only imagine how those delegates then would have felt if they could have joined the delegates to this year's Democratic Convention, when on August 28th, exactly 45 years to the day after King's famous "I Have a Dream" speech at the March on Washington, Barack Obama gave his acceptance speech as his party's nominee for President of the United States. Or how will those who were beaten and protested in Grant Park in 1968 will feel next week when Grant Park will be Barack Obama's election night headquarters? As historian Howard Zinn has written, not to believe in the possibility of dramatic change is to forget that things have changed. Not enough, of course, but enough to show what is possible. We have been surprised before in history. We can do this, we can be surprised again. Indeed, we can do the surprising. One change we know is coming. The current administration is going, and not a moment too soon. As yet another Minnesota said recently, we are a country in debt and decline. That was Thomas Friedman. The rich sit at the table, and the rest of us are on the menu. President Bush said he wanted to be a uniter. It took him 7 years, but boy, has he succeeded. He has united Americans around a desire for change. He's united Americans in our anxiety about our economic well-being, our dreams deferred, about an unpopular war of choice, about our reduced standing in the world. As Dr. King said about another unpopular war, in addition to the isolation of the people from the government, there is our national isolation in the world. Of course, the president never wanted to be a uniter. He thrived on Karl Rovian politics of divide and conquer. He lived in a fairy tale world of mission accomplished. For the first 6 years of his administration, the Republicans had the numbers, and some Democrats wouldn't take their own side in a fight. But when Democrats gained control of both houses of Congress after the 2006 midterm elections, it was a portent of the desire for change now sweeping the nation. Now an energized people must say yes to justice, yes to equality, yes to peace. We need to redeem the promise of our government. We need to reclaim our democracy for all, not for oil, to put our mutual obligations over mutual funds and the public interest over private wealth. This administration, too often with the complicity of the opposing party and the media, has brought us to the brink of disaster. We face increasing income inequality, a nationwide financial meltdown, and an energy crisis. They made up in chutzpah what they lacked in wisdom. They let a great American city drown, and they let an entire country down. Worst of all, they led the nation to war on false pretenses. More than 4,000 American troops have been killed in Iraq, and more than 30,000 wounded. There have been upwards of 100,000 casualties among Iraqi citizens. Off the battlefield, what's been sacrificed, along with our treasure, has been our adherence to the rule of law. From the Civil War to Vietnam, abuse of power has occurred in time of war. Abraham Lincoln succeeded habeas corpus during the Civil War. During Vietnam, we had J. Edgar Hoover's counterintelligence program called COINTELPRO. Using the perceived threat of communism as the excuse, the FBI tried to disrupt the civil rights movement and to smear Dr. King. They not only wanted him discredited, they wanted him dead, threatening him with the release of damaging information if he did not commit suicide. We thought we'd put a stop to these kinds of spies and lies, but that was before September 11th. That was before wiretapping without warrants. That was before the abolition of habeas corpus rights for detainees. That was before torture. That was before the Justice Department this month extended the FBI's surveillance powers. There's been abuse of power elsewhere, too. After 8 years of this administration, we're going to need another reconstruction, a reconstruction of a government which has been purposefully dismantled, privatized, and politicized. We're encouraged that the 2008 primary campaign saw across-the-board increases in voter turnout. Blacks and young people increased their share of the Democratic primary electorate by 25% over 2004. In 2004, 76% of Minnesota voters turned out at the polls, the highest turnout in the nation. Minnesota, I know you can do better than that this year. Why stay stuck at 74? And I know you want to be known for something other than Representative Michelle Bachmann. Recently, she blamed the financial crisis on black people because banks make loans on the basis of race and little else. She followed up that by pronouncing herself very concerned that Obama may have anti-American views and suggested the media take a great look at the views of the people in Congress and find out, are they pro-America or anti-America? She reminds me of another McCarthy, but I digress. A record 60.5 million voters, younger than 30, voted in this year's primaries and caucuses, becoming an influential bloc that leans progressive. National survey data document that each new generation is more tolerant than the one preceding it, and that each generation has become increasingly more tolerant as it ages. Overall, 9 in 10 whites say they'd be comfortable with a black presidency. I believe these attitudes have everything to do with the successful civil rights movement and the work the NAACP has waged for almost 100 years. That work infuses every election, given the lasting importance of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. But it has been especially evident this year. The Civil Rights Act of 1965 made discrimination based on race, gender, ethnicity, or religion illegal. Another act soon followed, making discrimination based on age illegal. The major candidates in both sides' primaries this year included a black man, a woman, a Hispanic, a Mormon, and a man, now his party's nominee, who would be the oldest person elected to the presidency. And in a first for his party, he has chosen a woman as his running mate. All of these candidates, and the nation, owe a debt to what Taylor Branch called the modern founders of democracy, those who labored unknown and unheralded in the vineyards of civil rights. But Senator Obama's candidacy does not herald a post-civil rights America, any more than his victory next week will mean that race as an issue has been vanquished in America. Race dictates where we live, and how long we live. Almost every social indicator, from birth to death, reflects black-white disparities. Infant mortality rates are 146% higher for blacks. Chances of imprisonment are 447% higher. Rates of death from homicide 521% higher. Lack of health insurance 42% more likely. Proportion with a college degree 60% lower. And the average white American will live 5.5 years longer than the average black American. In his speech following Hurricane Katrina, President Bush spoke of the deep, persistent poverty which exists in our country. That poverty, he said, has its roots in a history of racial discrimination. The truth is that race trumps class. As Michael Dyson has written, concentrated poverty doesn't victimize poor whites in the same way it victimizes poor blacks. The fragility of middle-class life for black Americans is illustrated by their downward mobility. Nearly half of blacks born into the middle class 40 years ago have descended into poverty or near poverty as adults, compared to only 16% of whites. Home ownership rates for blacks, already low, are sinking under the weight of the subprime mortgage crisis, which stands likely to be the largest loss of African American wealth that we have ever seen, wiping out a generation of home wealth building. Blacks are 3 times more likely to have subprime loans than whites, with such loans accounting for 55% of loans to blacks and only 17% of loans to whites. This didn't happen by accident. There's evidence that minority neighborhoods were actually targeted, that lenders have gone after people whom they think are less sophisticated borrowers. Of course, discriminatory lending is not confined to the subprime market, and it doesn't just victimize individuals. It affects entire families and communities. Last July, the NAACP filed a class action lawsuit against 17 of the nation's largest lenders, alleging discriminatory lending practices. All of this is occurring as we mark the 40th anniversary of the Fair Housing Act of 1968. Then, as now, we faced housing segregation that was the deliberate creation of official policies and practices of the United States. Legislative changes alone cannot create an integrated bias-free America. Today, the typical white resident of a metropolitan area lives in a neighborhood that is 80% white, while the typical black resident's neighborhood is 51% black. So we have much, much work to do. Continuing our history, the job we've done so far has been remarkable. No matter how long the journey has been, no matter how great the task that remains undone. Recently, I visited Berea College in Kentucky, opened by abolitionists as an integrated school in 1855. It was closed by the Civil War, but opened again in 1866 with 187 students, 96 blacks and 91 whites. It dared provide a rare commodity in the former slave states, an education that was open to all, to blacks, to whites, to women, and to men. One of these early students was my grandfather, James Bond. James Bond, born a slave, who at age 15, barely able to read or write, hitched his tuition, a steer, to a rope and walked 100 miles across Kentucky to enter Berea. When my grandfather graduated from Berea, the college asked him to deliver the commencement address. He said then, "The pessimist from his corner looks out on the world of wickedness and sin, and blinded by all that is good or hopeful in the progress of the human race, bewails the present state of affairs and predicts woeful things for the future. In every cloud he beholds a destructive storm, in every flash of lightning an omen of evil, and in every shadow that falls across his path a lurking foe. He forgets that the clouds also bring life and hope, that lightning purifies the atmosphere, that shadow and darkness prepare for sunshine and growth, and that hardships and adversity nerve the race as the individual for greater efforts and grander victories." Greater efforts and grander victories. Senator McCarthy, I think, would have embraced my grandfather's words and their sentiments. He spoke of the report of the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders as perhaps the most significant political document to be published in this country in this century. The report, which examined the violence in the nation's cities in the summer of 1967, concluded that our nation is moving toward 2 societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal. The cause, according to the report, was white racism. McCarthy said the report was written with honest optimism, the only kind we can accept, which comes when you see things to be as in fact they are, when you take an honest look at the situation. But having done that, you still proceed in the belief and the hope that something positive and constructive can be done about the circumstances. Greater efforts, grander victories, that was the promise Eugene McCarthy made to all of us. And that is a promise we all must seek to honor today. Thank you.